Sheriff Marcus Kane had been patrolling the back roads of Millbrook County for 23 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter on that fog-shrouded October night. The radio crackled with static as he drove deeper into the pine forest, following up on reports of strange lights and missing livestock from the Henderson farm. Unit 7 to dispatch, Marcus spoke into his radio, his voice echoing in the empty patrol car. Approaching the Henderson property now. Visibility is poor due to heavy fog. Only static answered back. He tried again, adjusting the frequency, but the radio remained dead. The fog had rolled in thick that evening, turning familiar roads into alien pathways. Ancient pine trees loomed like skeletal fingers on either side of the narrow gravel road, their branches scraping against his windshield with each gust of wind. The Henderson farm sat isolated at the end of a 3-mile dirt track, surrounded by dense woodland that hadn't been cleared in decades. As Marcus pulled up to the weathered farmhouse, his headlights cut through the mist, revealing something that made his blood run cold. The front door hung open, swaying gently in the wind, and every window in the house was dark. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel. The silence was absolute, no chirping insects, no rustling leaves, not even the distant lowing of cattle. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that seemed to press down on him like a heavy blanket. "Hello. Mr. Henderson?" Marcus called out, his voice swallowed by the fog. "This is Sheriff Kane. I'm here about your call." The beam of his flashlight swept across the yard, revealing overturned feed buckets and scattered hay. A wooden fence post had been snapped in half, its jagged end pointing toward the forest like an accusatory finger. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent. Marcus approached the open door cautiously, his hand resting on his service weapon. The porch steps creaked under his weight, and he could smell something metallic and wrong drifting from inside the house. His flashlight beam penetrated the darkness, revealing a living room in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, family photos lay shattered on the floor, and dark stains, too dark to be anything but blood, painted the walls in abstract patterns. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his training kicking in as he called out again. "Henderson family? Can anyone hear me?" He moved deeper into the house, his flashlight revealing more destruction with each step. The kitchen looked like a tornado had torn through it. Cabinets hung open, their contents scattered across the linoleum floor. A cast-iron skillet lay dented in the corner, and the refrigerator door was completely torn off its hinges. In the hallway, Marcus found the first body. Old Tom Henderson lay crumpled at the base of the stairs, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His eyes were wide open, staring at something only he could see, and his mouth was stretched in a silent scream. But it wasn't the look of death that made Marcus's hands shake, it was the way Tom's body was positioned. His limbs were bent at impossible angles, as if something had picked him up and twisted him like a rag doll. Marcus forced himself to check for a pulse, though he knew it was pointless. The skin was cold and waxy, and there was no sign of life. He tried his radio again, desperate to call for backup, but only static answered. A sound from upstairs made him freeze. It was a soft scraping, like fingernails being dragged across wood. Marcus drew his weapon and started up the stairs, each step seeming to echo forever in the oppressive silence. The second floor was even worse. Sarah Henderson, Tom's wife, was in the master bedroom, but Marcus had to look away immediately. What had been done to her was beyond comprehension, beyond anything human. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood and painted with what looked like blood. They seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing beam of his flashlight. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. Marcus spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. At the end of the hallway, something moved in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, and seemed to shift and blur at the edges like smoke. Two eyes, glowing with a sickly yellow light, stared at him from a face that wasn't quite human. "What the hell are you?" Marcus whispered, raising his weapon with trembling hands. The thing tilted its head, and Marcus heard something that chilled him to the bone: laughter. Not human laughter, but something that sounded like breaking glass mixed with the screams of dying animals. The creature began to move toward him, and Marcus could see that it wasn't walking so much as flowing, its form constantly shifting and changing. Marcus fired 3 shots center mass, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the hallway. The bullets passed right through the creature as if it were made of mist. The thing's laughter grew louder, more maniacal, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it was feeding off his fear. He turned and ran, crashing down the stairs and stumbling through the destroyed living room. Behind him, he could hear the creature following, its presence like ice water in his veins. The floorboards groaned and splintered under something that had no right to exist. Marcus burst through the front door and sprinted toward his patrol car, his lungs burning with each breath. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them. The engine turned over just as something slammed into the roof of the cruiser, denting it inward with a sound like thunder. He floored the accelerator, spraying gravel as he tore down the dirt road. In his rearview mirror, he could see the creature standing in the doorway of the farmhouse, watching him flee. Its yellow eyes seemed to burn through the darkness, and even at this distance, Marcus could feel its malevolent presence. The fog seemed to thicken as he drove, and Marcus realized with growing panic that he couldn't find his way back to the main road. The trees all looked the same, and the dirt track seemed to go on forever. His fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should, and his radio was still dead. Then he saw the lights. At first, he thought it was another patrol car, but as he got closer, he realized the lights were wrong. They were too bright, too blue, and they seemed to dance and weave through the trees like living things. Marcus slowed down, his training telling him to investigate, but every instinct screaming at him to run. The lights led him to a clearing he'd never seen before, despite patrolling these roads for over 2 decades. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of standing stones, ancient and weathered, covered in the same symbols he'd seen carved into the walls of the Henderson house. The blue lights danced around the stones like fireflies, and Marcus could hear something that sounded like chanting in a language that predated human speech. He was about to back away when he saw them, the missing people. Not just the Henderson family, but dozens of others who had vanished over the years. They stood in a circle around the stones, their eyes glowing with the same sickly yellow light as the creature. Their mouths moved in unison, forming words that hurt to hear. And in the center of the circle, growing stronger with each passing moment, was the thing from the farmhouse. It was massive now, fed by the fear and suffering of its victims. Its form was more solid, more real, and Marcus understood with crystal clarity that it was preparing to enter their world permanently. The chanting grew louder, and the stones began to glow. Marcus realized that he was witnessing something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting patiently for decades to complete its terrible work. The missing people weren't victims, they were willing servants, transformed by whatever dark power emanated from this place. As if sensing his presence, the creature turned its burning gaze toward him. Marcus felt his sanity beginning to crack under the weight of that stare. The thing spoke, its voice like grinding stone and screaming wind. "Welcome, Sheriff," it said, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "You're just in time to witness the birth of a new age." The last thing Marcus Kane remembered was the sound of his own screaming as the darkness rushed up to claim him. When search teams found his patrol car 3 days later, it was empty except for his badge and weapon. The car was found on a road that didn't exist on any map, surrounded by trees that the Forestry Service swore had been cut down 50 years ago. Marcus Kane was never seen again, but sometimes, on foggy October nights, other officers report seeing a lone patrol car driving the back roads of Millbrook County. The driver never responds to radio calls, and anyone who gets close enough to see inside reports that the car is empty, except for 2 glowing yellow eyes staring back at them from the darkness. The Henderson farm was burned to the ground by the state, officially due to structural damage, but the locals know better. They know that some things can't be destroyed by fire, and that the ancient evil that claimed Sheriff Kane is still out there, waiting in the fog-shrouded woods for the next curious soul to stumble into its web. The only evidence that remains is a single patrol report, filed the day before Marcus disappeared. In his own handwriting, it simply reads, "Something old is waking up. God help us all." And in the deep woods of Millbrook County, where the fog never quite lifts and the trees grow too close together, that something is still awake, still hungry, and still waiting for the next brave soul to answer its call. Sheriff Daniel Cross had always trusted his instincts. In 25 years of law enforcement in Blackwood County, they'd never steered him wrong. But on that cursed November night, every fiber of his being screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. It started with the 911 call at 11:47 p.m. A woman's voice, barely a whisper, reported intruders at the Old Mercy General Hospital, the one that had been abandoned for 15 years after the outbreak. The caller hung up before dispatch could get a name, but the terror in her voice was unmistakable. Daniel grabbed his duty belt and headed out into the storm. Rain lashed against his windshield as he drove through the deserted streets of Blackwood. The hospital loomed ahead like a cancer against the night sky, its broken windows staring down at him like hollow eyes. The main entrance was chained shut, but Daniel noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud leading around to the service entrance. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing that the back door had been forced open. The metal frame was twisted and bent, as if something with inhuman strength had simply torn it apart. "This is Sheriff Cross," he spoke into his radio. "I'm investigating a possible break-in at the old hospital. Requesting backup." Static filled the airwaves. Daniel frowned and tried again, but the radio remained dead. He checked his cell phone, no signal. The storm must have knocked out the towers. The hospital's interior was a tomb of decay and abandonment. Daniel's footsteps echoed through corridors lined with peeling paint and water-stained ceiling tiles. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. He remembered this place from before the closure. Mercy General had been the pride of Blackwood County until the infection started spreading. Patients had begun exhibiting violent psychotic episodes, attacking staff and each other with animalistic savagery. The CDC had quarantined the facility, but by then, 43 people were dead. The official story was a contaminated water supply. The unofficial story, whispered in bars and coffee shops, was something far more sinister. Daniel's flashlight beam swept across a nurse's station, revealing overturned chairs and scattered medical files. A clipboard hung from a chain, swaying gently in the stale air. He approached it cautiously and read the patient log. The dates were wrong, they showed today's date, November 15, 2024. "That's impossible," Daniel muttered, checking his watch. The hospital had been sealed for 15 years. A sound from deeper in the building made him freeze. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat amplified through the walls. Daniel drew his weapon and followed the sound down a corridor marked Psychiatric Ward. The thumping grew louder with each step. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as he passed room after room of open doors. Each contained a hospital bed, and each bed showed signs of recent occupation, rumpled sheets, dented pillows, the lingering smell of antiseptic and something else. Something organic and wrong. At the end of the corridor, double doors led to the psychiatric wing's common area. The thumping was coming from beyond those doors. Daniel pushed them open and stepped into a nightmare. The common area was filled with people. Dozens of them, all wearing hospital gowns, all standing perfectly still. They faced away from him, staring at something on the far wall. Their heads moved in unison, following an invisible pattern with mechanical precision. "Police!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. Everyone remained calm. None of them responded. None of them even acknowledged his presence. Daniel moved closer and saw that their feet were bare and bloody, as if they'd been walking for miles on broken glass. The rhythmic thumping was coming from their synchronized movement, a slow, hypnotic swaying that seemed to pulse with the building's electrical system. He circled around to see their faces and immediately wished he hadn't. Their eyes were gone, not closed, but completely absent, leaving only dark, weeping sockets. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, and their skin had a waxy, translucent quality that made him think of corpses. "Jesus Christ," Daniel whispered, backing away. "What the hell happened here?" The swaying stopped. Every head turned toward him with a wet, grinding sound. Where their eyes should have been, Daniel saw only infinite darkness, not empty sockets, but voids that seemed to extend forever into some unimaginable depth. One of them spoke, though its mouth didn't move. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, a chorus of whispers that filled Daniel's head. "Sheriff Cross," the voice said, and Daniel felt his sanity begin to crack. "We've been waiting for you." "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his weapon trembling in his grip. "What do you want?" "We are the touched," the voice replied. "The blessed. The first to receive his gift." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Daniel's breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the windows. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, creating a strobing effect that made the eyeless figures appear to move without actually moving. 15 years ago, the voice continued, he came to us through the water, through the air, through the very walls of this place. He showed us the truth about reality, about the thin barriers between worlds. We were the first to see, the first to understand. Daniel tried to back toward the door, but found his path blocked by more of the gowned figures. They had moved silently, surrounding him in a perfect circle. Up close, he could see that their hospital gowns were stained with substances that defied identification, dark patches that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. The infection, Daniel realized. "You're the patients from the outbreak." "We never left," the voice confirmed. "We couldn't leave. He wouldn't let us. We've been waiting here, preparing for his return. Maintaining the sacred space. Keeping the gateway open." The wall behind them began to change. The paint peeled away like old skin, revealing something underneath that hurt to look at directly. It was a doorway, but not to another room, to somewhere else entirely. Through the opening, Daniel could see a landscape of impossible geometry, where gravity worked differently and the sky was the color of dried blood. "The barrier is weakening," the voice said. "Soon, he will walk among the living again. Soon, everyone will have the gift of sight." Daniel raised his weapon. "I don't know what kind of cult bullshit this is, but you cannot kill what is already dead, Sheriff Cross." The figures began to move toward him, their movements jerky and unnatural. Daniel fired 3 shots into the nearest one, watching the bullets pass through its chest without effect. The thing didn't even slow down. Daniel ran. He crashed through the double doors and sprinted down the corridor, the sound of shuffling feet and whispered prayers following behind him. The hospital seemed to stretch longer with each step, the exit always just out of reach. Behind him, he could hear them chanting in that impossible voice, "Open the door. Open the door. Open the door." The lights went out completely, plunging Daniel into absolute darkness. His flashlight beam seemed weaker now, barely penetrating the oppressive black. He could hear them getting closer, their bare feet slapping against the wet floor. Daniel burst through the service entrance and into the storm, but the nightmare wasn't over. The parking lot was filled with vehicles, police cars, ambulances, even a fire truck. All of them were from 15 years ago, their paint faded and rust-eaten, but their emergency lights still flashing in the rain. And standing beside each vehicle was a figure in uniform. Paramedics, firefighters, police officers, all the first responders who had come to the hospital during the outbreak. All of them bearing the same eyeless faces, the same waxy skin, the same impossible presence. "You can't escape what you're meant to see," they said in unison. "The gift is for everyone." Daniel stumbled toward his patrol car, but found his way blocked by a familiar figure. Sheriff William Hayes, Daniel's predecessor, who had supposedly died of a heart attack 3 years after the outbreak. Hayes stood in full uniform, his badge gleaming despite the decay of his flesh. "Hello, Daniel," Hayes said, his voice like grinding glass. "I've been waiting to pass on the responsibility." "You're dead," Daniel whispered. "I went to your funeral. Death is just another room, son. Another way of seeing. The infection never really ended, it just went underground. We've been keeping it alive, feeding it, helping it grow. And now it's time for the next phase." Hayes extended his hand, and Daniel could see that his palm contained something that pulsed with its own light. It was organic, alive, and it radiated a cold that went deeper than bone. "Take it," Hayes commanded. "Take the gift, and join us in the true service. Help us open the door completely." Daniel backed away, but everywhere he turned, more figures emerged from the shadows. Hospital staff, patients, law enforcement, all the people who had been touched by whatever had infected Mercy General. They formed a circle around him, their eyeless faces turned toward the sky where storm clouds were beginning to part. Through the break in the clouds, Daniel could see something that made his mind rebel against reality. It was vast, tentacled, and covered in eyes that burned with the same darkness he'd seen in the faces of the infected. It was descending slowly, patiently, as if it had all the time in the world. "The door is opening," Hayes said. 15 years of preparation, and finally, he returns to claim what is his. Daniel felt something changing in his mind, a pressure building behind his eyes. The world around him began to shift and blur, revealing hidden layers of reality that humans were never meant to perceive. He could see the connections between all things, the threads of influence that the entity had been weaving through Blackwood County for decades. The infection hadn't been contained, it had been spreading slowly, invisibly, through the water supply, through the air, through simple human contact. Everyone in Blackwood had been touched by it, changed by it. They just didn't know it yet. "No," Daniel whispered, fighting against the revelation. "I won't let this happen." He raised his weapon one final time, but instead of pointing it at the approaching figures, he turned it on himself. If he was infected, if he was meant to be part of whatever was coming, then he would deny it the only way he could. "You can't stop what's already begun," Hayes said sadly. "The door is open. The gift is given. And tomorrow, when the sun rises, Blackwood County will be the first to welcome our new reality." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could pull it, the world exploded into light. When his vision cleared, he was standing in his patrol car, parked outside the hospital. The radio was crackling with normal dispatch chatter. His watch showed 11:45 p.m. "Unit 7, do you copy?" came dispatch's voice. "We have a 911 call reporting intruders at the old hospital." Daniel stared at the radio, his hands shaking. I copy, dispatch. En route." But as he started the engine, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. His eyes were gone, replaced by the same infinite darkness he'd seen in the faces of the infected. And in the distance, barely visible through the storm, something vast and tentacled was descending from the clouds. The door was open. The gift was given. And Sheriff Daniel Cross finally understood that some infections never truly end, they just wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. In Blackwood County, that moment had finally come. The last entry in Sheriff Cross's duty log, found 3 days later, read simply, "The door is open. God help us all. The door is open." Sheriff Rebecca Martinez had seen her share of darkness in the 15 years she'd been protecting Hollow Creek County. Drug busts, domestic violence, the occasional murder, but nothing had prepared her for what she would discover in the abandoned mining town of Shadowfall on that bitter December night. The call came in at 2:17 a.m. A trucker had reported seeing lights moving through the supposedly empty buildings of Shadowfall, a town that had been evacuated in 1989 after a series of unexplained disappearances. The mining company had sealed the tunnels and condemned the entire settlement, but locals still whispered about the things that had crawled up from the depths. Rebecca drove through the snow-covered mountains, her patrol car's headlights cutting through the blizzard. The road to Shadowfall was treacherous, winding through pine forests that seemed to press closer with each mile. She'd been to the ghost town only once before, as a rookie deputy, and the memory still gave her nightmares. The town appeared suddenly through the swirling snow, a cluster of dilapidated buildings huddled against the mountainside like wounded animals. Most of the structures were missing roofs or walls, their wooden frames bleached white by decades of harsh weather. But as Rebecca parked at the edge of the settlement, she could see something that made her blood run cold. Light flickered in the windows of the old company store. Not electric light, something warmer, more organic. Like firelight, but it moved with a purpose that fire never had. Rebecca checked her radio. Unit 12 to dispatch. I'm at Shadowfall investigating the reported lights. Radio check. Static filled the airwaves. She tried her cell phone, but the mountains had always been a dead zone. She was completely alone, 60 miles from the nearest backup, in a town that had been abandoned for 35 years. The snow crunched under her boots as she approached the company store. The building was larger than she remembered, its second-story windows staring down at her like eyes. The front door hung open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. Rebecca drew her weapon and clicked on her flashlight. "This is the sheriff's department," she called out. "Anyone inside needs to come out with their hands visible." The only response was the wind howling through the empty buildings. Rebecca stepped inside, her flashlight beam revealing a scene of organized chaos. The store had been ransacked decades ago, but someone had recently been here. Candles were arranged in a perfect circle on the floor, their flames dancing in the draft. The smell of melted wax mixed with something else, something metallic and wrong. In the center of the candle circle lay a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Rebecca holstered her weapon and picked up the book. The first entry was dated November 15, 1989, just 2 days before the town was evacuated. The mining foreman, Jake Hutchins, wrote this, Rebecca read aloud, her voice echoing in the empty store. November 15, 1989, they've broken through into something down in Tunnel 7. Not another cave system, something else. Something that was never meant to be opened. God help us all. Rebecca flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. The entries became increasingly erratic, the handwriting deteriorating as the days passed. Jake described miners going missing in the tunnels, their screams echoing from impossible depths. He wrote about things moving in the darkness, about shadows that had weight and substance. The final entry was barely legible, November 17, 1989, they're coming up. All of them. The town is lost. If anyone finds this, seal the tunnels. Burn everything. Don't let them spread. A sound from upstairs made Rebecca freeze. It was soft, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails being dragged across wood. She tucked the journal into her jacket and drew her weapon again. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed to the second floor. The scraping sound grew louder, more insistent. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. Light leaked through the crack, not candlelight, but something that pulsed with its own sickly luminescence. Rebecca pushed the door open and immediately wished she hadn't. The room was filled with them. Dozens of figures in mining gear, their faces hidden by helmet lamps that cast no light. They stood in perfect formation, their heads turned toward a hole in the floor that descended into infinite darkness. The scraping sound was coming from their fingernails as they clawed at the walls, the floor, their own skin. "Jesus Christ," Rebecca whispered, backing toward the door. One of the figures turned toward her. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just pale, waxy flesh that seemed to ripple like water. When it spoke, The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that bypassed her ears and went straight to her brain. "Sheriff Martinez," it said, and Rebecca felt her sanity crack. "You shouldn't have come here." "Who are you?" Rebecca demanded, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "We are the miners," the thing replied. "The ones who found what was never meant to be found. The ones who opened the door." The other figures began to turn toward her, their movements synchronized and unnatural. Rebecca could see that their mining gear was fused to their bodies, the metal and flesh blended together in ways that violated every law of biology. Their helmet lamps flickered with the same sickly light that pulsed from the hole in the floor. "The tunnel," Rebecca realized. "You're from Tunnel 7. "We were," the thing confirmed. "Before we became something more. Before we learned the truth about what lies beneath." The hole in the floor began to widen, its edges crumbling away to reveal more of the impossible depth below. Rebecca could see things moving in the darkness, shapes that hurt to look at directly, geometries that existed in too many dimensions. 35 years, the thing continued. 35 years we've been waiting, preparing, growing stronger. The town was just the beginning. The infection spread slowly, but it spreads. Rebecca tried to back away, but found her path blocked by more of the creatures. They had moved silently, surrounding her in the small room. Up close, she could see that their skin was translucent, revealing organs that pulsed with dark energy. "You've been exposed now," the thing said. "Just by being here, by breathing the air, by touching the journal. The spores are already in your system." Rebecca felt a tickling sensation in her throat, a tightness in her chest. She coughed, and something dark and wet splattered onto her hand. In the dim light, she could see tiny, writhing things in the substance, like worms, but made of shadow. "The change is beginning," the thing observed. "Soon, you'll understand what we've become. What we're all becoming." The room began to shift and blur around Rebecca. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, revealing glimpses of the vast network of tunnels that lay beneath Shadowfall. She could see other mining towns, other abandoned settlements, all connected by the same dark pathways. The infection hadn't been contained, it had been spreading underground for decades, following the old mining networks that connected half the state. "Every abandoned mine," the thing explained, as if reading her thoughts. "Every sealed tunnel. Every town that was evacuated for safety reasons. We've been patient, Sheriff Martinez. We've been thorough." Rebecca tried to speak, but her voice came out as a wet, rasping sound. She could feel things moving in her throat, in her lungs, changing her from the inside out. The world around her was becoming clearer, more detailed. She could see the connections between all things, the dark threads that bound the infected together. "The network is almost complete," the thing continued. "A few more towns, a few more conversions, and we'll have enough to begin the final phase. The surface world has no idea what's coming." Rebecca looked down at her hands and saw that her skin was beginning to change. It was becoming translucent, revealing the dark veins beneath. She could feel her face changing too, the features smoothing out, becoming featureless like the others. "Fight it," she whispered to herself. "Fight it." But the voice in her head was growing stronger, more insistent. It showed her visions of the world to come, a world where the boundaries between above and below had been dissolved, where the things from the depths walked freely among the living. It was beautiful, in its way. Peaceful. United. With tremendous effort, Rebecca pulled out her service weapon. The creatures watched her with their eyeless faces, showing no fear. They knew she couldn't hurt them with bullets. But that wasn't what she had in mind. "If I'm infected," she said, her voice already changing, "then I won't let it spread any further." She pressed the gun to her temple, but before she could pull the trigger, the weapon crumbled to dust in her hands. The infection was accelerating, consuming not just her body but everything she touched. "You can't stop what's already begun," the thing said sadly. "The network is complete. The transformation is irreversible. By dawn, every police station, every hospital, every government building in the state will have received our gift. Rebecca tried to scream, but only a wet, bubbling sound emerged. She could feel herself changing, becoming something else. Her memories were being rewritten, her personality subsumed into the collective consciousness of the infected. She was losing herself, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the hunger and the drive to spread. When the transformation was complete, Sheriff Rebecca Martinez stood with the others in the room above Tunnel 7. Her face was smooth and featureless, her skin translucent and pulsing with dark energy. She wore her uniform still, but it was fused to her body now, part of her new existence. "Welcome," the others said in unison. "Welcome to the network." Rebecca tried to remember who she had been, but the memories were fading like smoke. She was part of something larger now, something that had been waiting in the darkness for decades. The network was complete. The infection was ready to spread. She walked to the hole in the floor and looked down into the infinite depths. Somewhere far below, she could see the source of it all, the thing that had been sleeping beneath the earth for millennia, waiting for the right moment to wake. It was stirring now, preparing to rise. The mining town of Shadowfall was quiet again, its buildings dark and empty. But in the tunnels beneath, something vast and patient was beginning to move. The network was complete. The transformation was accelerating. And by dawn, the infection would spread to every corner of the state. The last entry in Sheriff Martinez's duty log, found a week later in her abandoned patrol car, read simply, "The network is complete. The transformation begins. God help us all." But by then, it was far too late. The infection had spread through the police networks, the hospitals, the government buildings. And in the abandoned mining towns scattered across the state, more lights began to flicker in empty windows, more figures began to move in the darkness. The network was complete. The transformation was beginning. And humanity's time on the surface was coming to an end. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood had been answering 911 calls for 18 years, but nothing had prepared him for the night when the calls started coming from the dead. It began on a rain-soaked Thursday in October. Thomas was working the midnight shift when dispatch patched through a call that made his blood run cold. The voice was familiar, Deputy Sarah Chen, who had been killed in a car accident 3 months earlier. "Sheriff Blackwood," Sarah's voice crackled through the radio, distorted by static but unmistakably hers. "I need you to come to Miller's Point. There's been an incident." Thomas stared at the radio, his hands trembling. "Dispatch, who authorized this call?" "Sir," came the confused voice of dispatcher Jenny Walsh. "What call?" "Your radio's been silent for the past hour." But Thomas could still hear Sarah's voice, fading in and out like a distant station. "Please, Sheriff. People are dying. I can't stop them alone." Miller's Point was a scenic overlook 20 miles outside Crimson County, the same spot where Sarah had died when her patrol car had skidded off the rain-slicked road. Thomas had been first on scene that night, had pulled her broken body from the wreckage himself. Against his better judgment, Thomas grabbed his duty gear and headed into the storm. The rain hammered his windshield as he drove the winding mountain road, each turn bringing back memories of that terrible night in July. He'd blamed himself for Sarah's death. She'd been responding to a domestic violence call that he should have taken. Miller's Point was deserted when he arrived, nothing but the old wooden safety barrier and the steep drop beyond. Thomas parked and stepped out into the rain, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam swept across the guardrail, stopping at a section that had been repaired after Sarah's accident. "Sarah," he called out, feeling foolish. "Sarah, are you here?" The rain stopped suddenly, as if someone had turned off a faucet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came Sarah's voice. "Behind you, Sheriff." Thomas spun around and nearly dropped his flashlight. Sarah stood 10 feet away, wearing her uniform, her badge gleaming in the beam of his light. She looked exactly as she had in life, except for her eyes. They were completely black, like pools of oil reflecting nothing. "Sarah," Thomas whispered. "How are you here?" "I never left," she replied, her voice carrying an echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "None of us did. We've been waiting." "None of us?" More figures emerged from the darkness. Thomas recognized them all, officers who had died in the line of duty over the past 2 decades. Deputy Martinez, killed in a shootout 5 years ago. Sergeant Williams, who had died of a heart attack during a pursuit. Officer Thompson, who had taken his own life after a corruption scandal. They all wore their uniforms, all bore their badges, and all had the same black, empty eyes. "The calls are coming through now," Sarah explained. "The barrier between worlds is weakening. We're receiving reports of incidents that haven't happened yet, or maybe they happened in another reality. Either way, we need your help." Thomas tried to back away, but found his feet wouldn't move. The dead officers formed a circle around him, their faces expressionless but somehow expectant. "This isn't real," Thomas said. "You're all dead. I went to your funerals." "Death is just another beat," Williams said, his voice like grinding gravel. "Another jurisdiction to patrol." Sarah stepped closer, and Thomas could see that her uniform was still stained with blood from the accident. "We've been monitoring the calls from the other side. Strange things are happening in Crimson County. Things that the living can't handle alone." As if on cue, Thomas's radio crackled to life. But the voice that came through wasn't dispatch, it was his own voice, terrified and desperate. "This is Sheriff Blackwood. I need all available units to respond to 1247 Elm Street. We have multiple casualties, possibly supernatural in nature. I repeat, this is not a drill." Thomas grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, was that transmission from me?" "Sheriff," came Jenny's confused voice. "You haven't transmitted anything. Are you feeling okay?" The dead officers watched him with their hollow eyes. "You're hearing the calls from tomorrow night," Sarah explained. "Or maybe next week. Time moves differently for us now." Another transmission came through, this one from Deputy Martinez's voice. "Though Martinez had been dead for years, all units, we have a situation at the old cemetery. The graves are. Jesus Christ, they're all empty. Every single one." Thomas felt his sanity slipping. "What do you want from me?" "We want you to answer the calls," Sarah said. "We want you to help us prevent what's coming. The living world is about to experience something that only the dead can understand." The radio crackled again, this time with an unfamiliar voice speaking in a language that hurt to hear. "IA. IA. The sleeper wakes. The barrier falls. The dead shall walk among the living." Thomas yanked the radio from his belt and threw it to the ground, but the voice continued, now seeming to come from the very air around him. The dead officers began to move, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a drunken puppeteer. "It's starting," Sarah said, her voice now layered with harmonics that made Thomas's teeth ache. "The convergence. The time when the living and the dead share the same space." The world around Thomas began to change. The mountain road was still there, but now it was overlaid with glimpses of other places, other times. He could see the main street of Crimson County, but it was filled with figures that cast no shadows. He could see the sheriff's station, but its windows were boarded up and spray-painted with symbols that seemed to writhe and move. "Every call you didn't answer," Martinez said, his voice echoing from multiple directions. "Every case you couldn't solve. Every victim you couldn't save. They're all here now, in the space between worlds." Thomas tried to run, but his legs moved as if through molasses. The dead officers followed him, their footsteps making no sound on the wet pavement. Behind them, the darkness was filled with other shapes, victims, suspects, witnesses, all the people who had died in Crimson County over the years. "The calls are coming through faster now," Sarah observed. "Can you hear them?" Thomas could. His radio was still on the ground, but voices were pouring from it in an endless stream. Reports of murders that hadn't happened yet, domestic disputes involving people who didn't exist, car accidents on roads that hadn't been built. Each voice was familiar, officers he'd known, dispatchers he'd worked with, all of them dead. "This is Deputy Chen reporting at 10 to 54 at the intersection of reality and nightmare," Sarah's voice said from the radio. "Multiple casualties, cause unknown. Requesting backup from the living world." Thomas stumbled and fell, his hands scraping against the wet asphalt. When he looked up, the dead officers were standing over him, their black eyes reflecting the storm clouds above. "You have to choose," Sarah said. "You can go back to your world, pretend this never happened, and watch as the convergence destroys everything you've sworn to protect. Or you can join us, help us patrol the boundary between life and death." "I won't become like you," Thomas gasped. "You already are," William said sadly. "You died with each of us. Every time you lost an officer, a piece of you stayed with them. That's why you can hear the calls. That's why you can see us." Thomas looked down at his hands and saw that they were becoming translucent. His uniform was fading, becoming the same ghostly blue as the others. He could feel his heart slowing, his breathing becoming shallow. "The convergence requires a living officer to anchor it," Sarah explained. "Someone who can exist in both worlds. Someone who can answer the calls from both sides." The radio crackled again, this time with Thomas's own voice, but speaking words he'd never said. "This is Sheriff Blackwood. I'm crossing over. The living world is now under the protection of the dead. May God have mercy on us all." Thomas felt himself changing, becoming something between life and death. The world around him shifted again, and he could see both versions of Crimson County, the living world where people went about their daily lives, and the shadow world where the dead continued their eternal patrol. "Welcome to the Force," Sarah said, pinning a badge to his chest. It was his own badge, but now it was made of tarnished silver and bore symbols that seemed to move in the light. Thomas stood up, his body feeling both lighter and heavier than before. He could hear the calls now, dozens of them, from both worlds. Crimes that had happened, crimes that would happen, crimes that existed only in the spaces between reality. "This is Sheriff Blackwood," he said into his radio, his voice carrying across multiple dimensions. "I'm now patrolling both sides of the law. All units, living and dead, report for duty." The response came from officers across space and time, their voices blending into a chorus that only he could hear. The dead had found their living anchor, and the living world had gained a protector who could see beyond the veil. But as Thomas walked back to his patrol car, now a ghostly vehicle that existed in both worlds, he realized the terrible truth. The convergence wasn't something that was coming, it was something that had already happened. The living world was already filled with the dead, and the dead world was crowded with the living. The only difference was that now, someone was finally answering the calls from both sides. The last entry in the Crimson County Sheriff's log, found the next morning in Thomas's empty patrol car, read simply, "The calls never stop. The beat goes on. Both sides of the law are now under protection." But in the shadow world, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood continued his patrol, answering calls from the living and the dead, maintaining order in a reality where the boundaries between life and death had become meaningless. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the veil was thin, living officers would hear his voice on their radios, offering backup they couldn't see but desperately needed. The dead had found their sheriff, and the living world would never be the same.